US President Trump has said that talks with Iran could resume in coming days, following unsuccessful meetings in Islamabad the previous weekend. The talks have mainly been stuck over the fate of Iran's nuclear program, as well as the highly enriched uranium stockpile still hidden inside the country. The US has proposed a suspension of Iran's nuclear activity for 20 years, while Iran responded with a counteroffer of 5 years. The fact that the two have continued to trade these offers could suggest that another round of talks is forthcoming. But a lot of uncertainty remains, as the US is still looking for a way to break the deadlock. America's military said that its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, begun on Monday, April 13th, has been fully implemented, and that its navy is currently exercising maritime superiority over the strait. The blockade aims to apply economic pressure on Iran by refusing to let it export oil through the strait, in the hope that the economic damage will soften its negotiating positions. In response, Iran has warned that it will block shipping through the Red Sea if the blockade continues, the other vital maritime route in and out of the region. It comes as the US is sending thousands of additional troops to the region in coming days, even as Trump strikes an optimistic tone about the talks. Yet, even if they do prove successful, it's unclear whether any permanent halt in fighting between the two countries could extend to the wider region. Israel's chief of Mossad, David Barnea, said on Tuesday that Israel's mission in Iran is incomplete until the fall of Iran's government, seeming to contradict Trump's statements that the war is nearly over and negotiations could bear fruit. In the meantime, Israel is continuing to conduct strikes across Lebanon, while readying for what appears to be a long-term military presence in the country's south. On Wednesday, it issued fresh evacuation orders for residents south of the Zahrani River, which will only add to the 1.2 million people already displaced in the country, about a quarter of its total population. As Israel's campaign in Lebanon continues, the Israeli and Lebanese ambassadors to Washington met on Tuesday to discuss plans to disarm Hezbollah, although with no clear outcome following the meeting. So, how likely is a permanent US-Iran ceasefire? And even if a deal is agreed, could Israel's actions in Lebanon and elsewhere thwart it? To find out, I'm speaking to Alon Pinkas, a former Israeli diplomat and writer. Alon, welcome to Middle East Eye, and thanks so much for making the time to speak today.
My pleasure, Tamara, always.
So I want to begin by asking you, we know now that this US blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is in its third day. It's claimed that this economic pressure will force Iran into a more dovish position at the negotiating table. How likely do you think that is?
Well, it's likely in the sense that both sides already indicated that they're willing to go back to the negotiating table. Although, oddly, they said that the time and the venue have not been determined yet. So I don't understand. I mean, you would expect some more urgency and some more speed or rapidness in these negotiations. And I haven't seen any. Now, as for the blockade, look, the blockade is not going to last for long. It is not going to last for long for two totally different reasons. One is either there's an agreement in the next, say, week, even a temporary agreement, even a preliminary agreement, after which the strait is going to be open and the U.S. blockade is going to be removed or lifted. The second possibility is that all-out war breaks again, in which case the blockade becomes almost irrelevant. Now, for the benefit of our viewers, let's go over the structure of the elements of this blockade. The blockade basically prevents Iranian vessels leaving Iranian ports going through the Strait of Hormuz. It does not prevent other ships from Kuwait, from the United Arab Emirates, from Qatar, from Bahrain to crossing the strait. And commensurately, about 6 Iranian tankers were interdicted and reversed course, but 20 ships in the last 48 hours have been allowed to pass. Where is this a problem? It's a problem, as you mentioned correctly, in terms of Iran's economy, because 90% of Iran's oil is maritime borne or seaborne. and goes through the Isle of Hajj in the north of the Persian Gulf, about 650 kilometers north of Hormuz, and it is then put on tankers, and these tankers make their way down south to Hormuz. So that's going to be a problem for Iran, because they are unable to export their oil. The second and probably most pressing problem is that 90% of that oil is bound to China. And until now, China did not have a problem and sort of kept not a low profile, even by Chinese usually mellow standards, because most of the oil that they needed was already seaborne before the war began. Number one. Number two, they have strategic reserves for anywhere between 4 to 7 months. So they were not okay with it, but they were tolerant. They did not warn or threaten or condemn the U.S. But in the last 48 hours, they've sort of changed course in a very Chinese way, in a very moderate way. Xi Jinping, the president, said that we cannot revert to the laws of the jungle. And an official Chinese government statement said that what the U.S., well, without mentioning the U.S., what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz is very dangerous and destabilizing, and so
I
on.
suppose the U.S. hopes that its blockade could, by cutting off those exports, could incentivize China to place greater pressure on Iran at the negotiating table, as one of the few kind of partners of a very lonely government.
The problem I have with that this argument makes perfect sense. You pressure Iran so the oil won't get to China, which pressures China to then in turn pressure Iran to come back to the negotiating table under better circumstances. Except for one thing. It requires a sophistication from the U.S. that I haven't seen until now. I mean, these are the same people who never thought the Iranians would strike the Arab Gulf countries, who never fathomed that they will shut down the Strait of Hormuz, who actually thought the regime is going to collapse, who actually thought Iran will capitulate. I remind you, Tamara, that in the first week of the war, Trump was bragging and boasting that he demands unconditional surrender, which is something that Japan did in 1945, Germany did in 1945, or the Confederacy did in 1865. That obviously didn't happen. And so to assume that they are so sophisticated that they thought of this blockade to pressure Iran so that pressure would be applied on the Chinese economy, and they then would lean on the Iranians to go back to the negotiating table. That's not how the Chinese operate. The Chinese are just enjoying watching the U.S. getting itself further and further, or deeper and deeper, rather, stuck in this quagmire. But I go back to my very first point. I don't think this is going to last too long. Either there's an agreement or there's war. This status quo of no agreement, no negotiations, no war, but a blockade, I don't think that's sustainable.
You mentioned some miscalculation on the part of the U.S. as to the resilience of Iran's leadership. And you noted, President Trump was talking about unconditional surrender earlier on in the war, and talks of regime change have now been significantly moderated as opposed to a month and a half ago. That disappointment was not only true of Washington, it was also true in Israel. And there was a sense, especially the grandeur and bravado with which Prime Minister Netanyahu was speaking at the outset of the war, no longer seems applicable. We know many Israelis are uncomfortable with the ceasefire, to put it mildly, and are really doubtful that if there is a deal between the U.S. and Iran, it will take Israel's security needs sufficiently into account. How is Netanyahu and how are Israelis more broadly looking at the prospect of a US-Iran deal? And do you see a chance that Israel may act as a spoiler to try and damage those chances?
Well, they did. They did try and spoil it and derail it via attacks in Lebanon. I mean, the most fiercest of attacks in Lebanon occurred a day after, last Wednesday, a day after the ceasefire went into effect, which was last Tuesday, a week ago, 7 or 8 days ago, respectively. Look, you put forth probably the most important issue here. I mean, in terms of analyzing the war, and that is who's the biggest loser here? Is it Trump or is it Netanyahu? And there's a case to be made that Trump, for Trump, this was a march of folly. I mean, he went into a war without clear objectives, without U.S. interests being endangered, without a vital U.S. interest that he needs to advance, promote, or attain. And there was no reason for the U.S. to go into this war. This is one set of criticism aimed at Trump. But from an Israeli point of view, supposedly there was a raison d'etre. There was a reason to go into this war. This is something that Mr. Netanyahu has been talking about for 20 years. In fact, he himself boasted, I yearned for this for 40 years, quote unquote, in the first week. And from an Israeli point of view, all premises have been disproven or refuted by reality. The regime did not collapse. We did not see a popular uprising. Decapitation of Iran's leadership did not bring any kind of changes in Iran's external behavior. If anything, arguably, it achieved the exact opposite. Maybe it'll happen in a year. I don't know. But until now, it did not. As of this point, it did not. Iran maintains both its missile production and, more importantly, missile launching capabilities. And there are still, as you mentioned before, there are still 450, approximately 450, that's about 920 some pounds of unaccounted for uranium enriched to 60%. That's very close. I mean, it looks big. I mean, the difference looks big, the wide between 60% and the so-called 90% required for military grade uranium. But A, you can build a so-called dirty bomb with 60%, and B, more crucially, the getting to 60 is the difficult part. The 60 to 90 is relatively short. Now, weaponizing this is a different story. Mounting it on a missile is a different story. But if the nuclear issue was the main reason why Israel went into this war, aside from the regime change, of course they're interlocked, then that objective has not been achieved either.
Do you think
there's a case to be made that from Israel's point of view, this was even a bigger failure than it was for Trump?
Do you think part of the issue then is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has, to some extent, backed himself into a corner, right? He set up these grand aims in Iran, created a great degree of build-up and fanfare. And, as one analyst noted, he's declared a victory in Gaza. He's declared a victory in Lebanon, and now twice in Iran, only for those to prove quite hollow, even despite the military successes. So do you think in some way that his inability to kind of sell this ceasefire as a win to Israelis, which I think bears out in the polling, will, if anything, incentivize him to, militarily go even harder in Lebanon, let's say, as we've seen already? Because I just don't see a way in which, we know Israel can't really fight in Iran without the US. So then I don't see a way in which they kind of accept the current status quo.
You're absolutely right. But the problem here is that the fighting in Lebanon is exacting a price from Israel in both missiles, rockets, and drones, and soldiers being shot at, injured, or even killed. Unlike the missile exchange with Iran, that I'm not saying it was nice. I live in Tel Aviv. We had 77 sirens. There were missiles falling right next to where I am speaking to you from. All that said, in relative terms, the cost that Israel paid for the war with Iran was tolerable. It was okay. Not great, not anything anyone likes, but it was okay. In Lebanon, the cost is very tangible, and I don't think deepening or intensifying the war in Lebanon is going to gain Mr. Netanyahu any points.
As you mentioned, Prime Minister Netanyahu has a proclivity for kind of maximalist, totalistic objectives, usually with overwhelming military force, and yet a real avoidance for kind of any meaningful political resolutions on these fronts.
I'll tell you what he has. I'll tell you what he has, Tamara. It's called delusions of grandeur. He thinks he can remodel or redraw the landscape of the Middle East just because he thinks he understands the mechanics and the dynamics. Reality thinks differently.
I want to ask you more specifically about redrawing that landscape. We've seen, Israel ordering these mass evacuations in Lebanon's south of the Litani, and more recently south of the Zahrani River. There's been talk of a security or buffer zone in Lebanon's south of the Litani. We've seen buildings being demolished in the south and new outposts being built. I mean, you say this war will exact political cost, but it seems to be one at the moment that Netanyahu is willing to pay, as he again insists on another maximalist objective, which is full disarmament of Hezbollah. Are we looking at another long-term Israeli military occupation in the country's south, and to what effect?
You're absolutely right. He's behaving like Nero Caesar in Rome. Everything is burning, and he's playing his musical instrument or singing because he thinks it doesn't have any effect on him, or that he didn't have any effect on it. Look, we've been in the security zone ball game several times before. After the 1978 Operation Litani, certainly after the 1982 war in Lebanon, and then the 1985 creation of a semi-formal or informal buffer zone that existed for 15 years until we withdrew in the year 2000. And what you had, in the beginning, it was against the PLO, but then we found ourselves fighting Amal. Then it was against Amal, but then we found ourselves fighting against Hezbollah, which more or less swallowed Amal in terms of domestic Lebanese politics. Doing this right now, you call it occupation. It's a creeping occupation. It begins with the most, innocuous and innocent proclamations that this is temporary, that this is just security-oriented, that this is just meant to prevent Hezbollah from infiltrating down south to close to the Israeli border or launching short-range or medium-range rockets. But then you create a buffer zone, but then you need to fortify that buffer zone. And then you say, well, they're actually firing from north of the buffer zone, from beyond the buffer zone. So we need 5 more miles or 5 more kilometers, doesn't matter, to expand the buffer zone. And then you set up a line of stationary posts, military posts. They become targets. They need logistical assistance. They need munitions. They need water. They need food.
And so the occupation grows and grows.
Exactly. Everything becomes everything becomes a target. Now, this idea that we will drive the population north so they will pressure the Lebanese government, which in turn would pressure Hezbollah, we've been there before. We've been there in the 90s. In 1993, there was a big operation. And again, in 1996, there was a big operation. And that was the prevailing logic. That was the idea. By 2000, Israel finally realized and concluded that this was a silly, stupid, not cost-effective idea. To think that anyone in his right mind in Israel right now, and not many people are in their right minds in Israeli government, to think that anyone is actually thinking that this could be replicated, that this could be, improved, an improved occupation, an improved security zone, a better buffer zone, that's nonsense. It's going to result, it's going to end with the same results.
I guess I'll close by asking you then, We've seen these high-level contacts between Israel and Lebanon's ambassadors to Washington on Tuesday. But despite the kind of pleasantries and the photographs, it seems we're still at this impasse where Israel is demanding that the Lebanese government somehow disarm Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government is requesting a ceasefire, and neither are able or willing to do so. Do you think this diplomatic process leads anywhere? Do you see the US able to rein in Israel's ambitions in Lebanon at all? Or do you think, as you put it, this stupid, not cost-effective plan is unfortunately the one that will be most likely going ahead to the detriment of the Lebanese population?
Let's start with the obvious. If Israel really wanted to reach some kind of an agreement with the Lebanese, Israel would announce a unilateral ceasefire. And only under the conditions of a unilateral ceasefire, expecting reciprocity, then you start negotiating. Number one. Number two, you called it high level. I don't. Ambassador level, I used to be ambassador, ambassador level, with all due respect and fanfare, is not high level. It is not a decision-making forum. That the Lebanese ambassador in Washington has a lot of goodwill and positive vibes is great. She doesn't make the decisions. Tell you more than that. The Lebanese government, whose interests I believe are to end this, they can't rein in Hezbollah. They haven't. They're just incapable of doing so. There was a ceasefire agreement signed on the 27th of November 2024, just a year and a half ago, ending the Israeli Hezbollah theater, which was expanded from the Israeli Gazan theater. Part of that agreement was that the Lebanese army would disarm Hezbollah. Okay? Have you seen that happening? Because no one has. Because it didn't, because they're incapable of, even if they have the best of intentions. Nothing changed. I am absolutely certain that the Lebanese government wants to end this. I'm absolutely certain that a vast majority of the citizens of Lebanon have had enough. They seem to have to pay a price, or anything that goes wrong in the Middle East somehow inflicts pain and ruin on Lebanon. And there are good people there, and they don't want Hezbollah in their midst. Yet Hezbollah is not going anywhere. And Hezbollah is organic to Lebanese politics. Hezbollah, they're not a bunch of crusaders or a distant tribe that found itself, like the PLO were in the 70s and 80s, that they were transported from Jordan to Lebanon and set base. Hezbollah, they're Lebanese. And I don't see that happening, at least not in the foreseeable future. So as for these negotiations, the best we can hope for is a ceasefire. I don't see any kind of agreement.
Bleak diplomatic outlook, but informative nonetheless. Informative nonetheless. Alon Pinkas, thank you so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today and sharing your analysis. A pleasure as always.